Aliens humiliated Earth publicly. By dawn, every agreement was burned. The translator implant in my ear had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. 600 delegates from 200 species sat in the grand conclave chamber, and every single one of them was looking at me. Not with curiosity, not with respect, with something closer to satisfaction. My name is Cale Doran. I am, or was, as of about 40 seconds ago, Earth's senior ambassador to the Galactic Conclave. I had held that position for 9 years. I had memorized 17 alien languages, shaken hands with creatures that had no hands, and drunk beverages that a lab back home could not fully identify. I had done all of it with a smile because that was the job. Tonight, the job had become something else entirely. Supreme Delegate Vorath of the Kethari stood at the central platform. He was tall, even by his species standards. Pale blue skin stretched over a frame that looked assembled rather than born, with 4 narrow eyes that never seemed to blink all at once. He had a voice like a low bell, clear and cold, and when he spoke, the entire chamber listened without being asked to. He had called this session a celebration. 12 years of Earth's probationary membership. Tonight, he had said in the pre-session briefing, humanity would be formally welcomed into full standing. I had prepared a speech, 3 minutes, gracious, warm, forward-looking. I had practiced it in the mirror that morning. Vorath had not invited me to give it. Instead, he tabled a motion. He called it a civilizational review. He said the word with great care, the way you say something that has been rehearsed many times in private. The Conclave's translation network rendered it perfectly into every language simultaneously, and I felt the chamber shift the moment the words landed. Then the screens came on. They covered every wall of the chamber, enormous curved panels that the Conclave used for treaty projections and star maps. Now they displayed Earth, not the Earth of our best moments, not the cities lit up at night, not the volunteers rebuilding coastlines, not the research stations on the edge of the solar system. They showed our wars, centuries of them compressed into a precise and devastating sequence. They showed industrial damage from 200 years prior. They showed crowded hospitals and crumbling infrastructure, and every image that, taken out of context, made humanity look like a species that had barely survived itself. It was broadcasting live, not just in this chamber. Vorath had activated the Conclave's full public transmission array. Every inhabited system in the galaxy was receiving this feed in real time. I knew this because the small notification light on my wrist communicator, the one linked to Earth's embassy monitoring system, had turned red. That light only turned red when the signal was galaxy-wide. Billions of eyes, watching Earth be dissected like a specimen. Vorath spoke through the entire presentation. His tone was not cruel, which was somehow worse than if it had been. He was calm, clinical. He spoke about humanity's ongoing developmental instability. He used phrases like managed integration and supervised participation. He proposed that Earth's full membership be postponed indefinitely, pending further review by a committee that he, naturally, would chair. Then he looked at me. "Ambassador Doran," he said, "the Conclave recognizes your presence and invites your acknowledgement of the findings presented." The room was silent, 200 species waiting. Acknowledgement, that was the word he chose, not response, not rebuttal. Acknowledgement, as if the only appropriate answer was agreement, as if I was there to confirm their conclusion, sign the bottom of my own species' verdict, and make it clean for the historical record. I stood up slowly. I walked to the speaker's platform the way I always did, measured steps, shoulders back, the walk I had practiced because appearing calm under pressure was something humans learned to perform long before we ever met another species. I stood at the mic. The chamber waited. I looked at Vorath. I looked at the screen still cycling through humanity's lowest moments. I looked at the 600 delegates, some of whom I had shared meals with, some of whom I had negotiated alongside for nearly a decade. I looked at the small amber light on the Earl ambassador's collar, blinking in a pattern I recognized as distress in their species' body language. She had not known this was coming either. I stepped back from the microphone. I did not speak. I turned, walked back to my seat, picked up my folio, and walked out of the chamber. Not quickly, not with drama. The way you leave a room when you have decided, fully and finally, that there is nothing left to say inside it. The door behind me closed with a soft mechanical sound. The corridor was long and white and empty. The station's ambient hum filled the silence. My footsteps were the only other sound. I stopped walking when I reached the curved viewport at the end of the hall. Stars outside. The same stars I had looked at from a field in western England when I was 9 years old, lying on my back in the grass, certain that whatever was out there, it was extraordinary. I stood there for a moment. My hands were at my sides. I noticed with some detachment that they were completely steady. That surprised me. I had expected anger to feel louder than this. I had expected my pulse to be racing. Instead, there was just a very clear, very quiet awareness settling into place, like a structure snapping into alignment. They had spent months preparing this. The broadcast authorization alone required pre-approval from 12 member species. This had not been a decision made in reaction to anything Earth did. It had been designed, scheduled, intended to land at this precise moment in this precise session with maximum audience and minimum warning. They had built a stage for our humiliation. What they did not understand, what they could not have known, because they had been watching our failures and not our nature, was that humans do not process humiliation the way most species do. We do not collapse under it. We do not retreat from it. We learn from it, and then, very quietly, we start working. My communicator vibrated. A message from Deputy Ambassador Claire Avery back in the embassy sublevels. 4 words. We saw it come down. I turned away from the viewport. I walked back down the corridor, away from the chamber, away from the screens, away from Vorath and his careful voice and his 600 witnesses. There was a great deal of work to do before morning. Part 2. Claire had not slept. I could tell by the way she was standing, very still, the kind of stillness that comes from being too alert rather than too calm. She had a tablet in each hand and a third one propped on the edge of the communications console. The embassy's lower level was bright and quiet, and the rest of the small team was already there. Deputy Counsel Owen Marsh, Communications Director Priya Solis, and our 2 legal attachés, End Hollies and Francis Quinn. They looked up when I walked in. Nobody spoke first. I know what you watched, I said. Tell me what you know that I don't. Owen pulled up a display without being asked. He had been working since the session started, and I could see the lines of data he had already assembled. Owen was the kind of person who responded to bad news by building something useful out of it. That was why I had requested him for this posting. The broadcast authorization, he said. I traced it back through the conclave's public filing system, 12 co-signatories, as required for a galaxy-wide public transmission. All 12 filed their authorizations between 40 and 50 days ago. 40 to 50 days, I repeated. The motion itself was drafted 63 days ago, Frances added, from her seat at the far console. I found the preliminary filing record. It was registered under a procedural category called Membership Standards Evaluation. That category has its own filing protocols, which means it bypassed the normal session preview that all member ambassadors receive. They hid it in a procedural subcategory, Priya said. We never saw it coming because we were never supposed to. I sat down. What about the presentation itself, the footage? Curated with precision, End said. He was younger than the rest of us, but he had the kind of focused attention that made him excellent at finding details others overlooked. Everything they showed was technically accurate, in the way that a photograph of someone's worst day is technically accurate. They avoided anything post-2180. All the footage predates the Global Climate Compact, the Unified Infrastructure Agreements, every major advancement we've made in the last 60 years. They wanted to freeze us in time, I said. They wanted the galaxy to see us the way they've already decided to see us, Claire said quietly. This was not a review. This was a verdict they wrote before they ever asked the question. The room was quiet for a moment. Tell me what we have, I said. This was the part I had been waiting to reach, because the past 9 years had not been only about diplomacy. They had also been about preparation, not for conflict, for contingency. Humans are builders, yes, but we are also planners. We account for failure. We maintain what our engineers call a redundancy stack. Every critical system backed up by a second system, every second system backed up by a third. I had built a diplomatic redundancy stack, quietly, methodically, over 9 years. Claire set down both tablets and picked up the third one. The resource mapping, she said. Every survey vessel we deployed under the Scientific Exchange Accords has been operating under dual-purpose protocols. Primary mission, legitimate scientific survey, as filed with the conclave. Secondary mission, comprehensive system mapping of every member species' home and colony territory. All of it filed under the Exchange Accords, I confirmed. Accords that the Kethari themselves wrote and proposed 8 years ago. The data is ours, N said. Legally, cleanly, without question. We have detailed stellar cartography, resource distribution models, and infrastructure assessments for 94 member systems. More complete data than most of those species have of their own territory. That is leverage, Owen said carefully, if we choose to use it. We are not going to threaten anyone with it, I said, but they need to know we have it. There is a difference between a threat and a demonstration of capability. We are going to demonstrate capability. I looked at Frances, the trade violations. She nodded slowly. She had been building this file for 3 years. The Kethori's trade agreements with 14 smaller member species contain clauses that violate the Conclave's own resource equity statutes from 2241. The violations are not ambiguous. They required those species to export primary resources at fixed rates below market value, in exchange for conclave membership consideration, which is explicitly prohibited under the statutes. And those species knew about the violations, Claire asked. Some of them. Most signed because they were told it was standard procedure. The Kethori relied on those species not having the legal staff to identify the problem. We have the legal staff, N said. We have the legal staff, Frances confirmed. I stood up and walked to the center of the room. Here is what tonight showed us. The Kethori are not just diplomatically dominant in this conclave. They are structurally embedded in it. They wrote many of its procedures. They chair most of its review bodies. They have spent decades making sure that the rules of this institution favor them so naturally that no one thinks to question it. And they assumed, correctly, until tonight, that every species in this conclave would rather stay inside the structure than challenge it. Because challenging it means losing the protections it provides, Priya said. Yes, every smaller species in this conclave depends on Kethori goodwill for trade access, transit rights, and security guarantees. Challenging the Kethori means risking all of that. Unless, Claire said slowly, they had someone to stand with. Unless they had someone who had already decided to challenge, I said. Someone who had, by the time they woke up in the morning, already removed themselves from the structure and therefore had nothing to lose. The room understood. We are going to withdraw, Owen said. It was not a question. Every treaty we have with the conclave's central body, I said. Not with individual species, those relationships stay intact, but every agreement we signed with the conclave as an institution. I reviewed our treaty stack 4 months ago, specifically looking for this. Every document has a 90-day termination clause. It is standard language included by default. No one thought we would ever use it. We are going to use it, Francis said. Tonight, I confirmed. Before the morning session opens, we file termination notices simultaneously, hand-delivered by our attachés to every relevant embassy. 67 documents. Priya looked up sharply. That is going to send a signal across the entire station within an hour of the first delivery. Good, that is the point. And the violations file? Ind asked. We do not leak it, I said. Leaking it would make us look reactive. Instead, Francis is going to file it formally with the Conclave Ethics Tribunal as an official legal submission. Not a complaint lodged in anger, a structured, evidenced, procedurally correct filing that the tribunal is legally required to process. Francis already had her tablet open. I can have the submission prepared in 2 hours. You have 90 minutes, I said, because we also need time for the other piece. I looked at Priya. She had been quiet for most of the conversation, which meant she was already thinking about it. The 7, she said. The 7, I confirmed. Over 9 years, I had identified 7 species within the conclave whose ambassadors had expressed, in private conversations, varying degrees of dissatisfaction with Kethori dominance. None of them had ever said anything publicly. None of them would have moved alone, but I had maintained those relationships carefully, meeting for meals, exchanging small favors, being present in ways that did not ask for anything in return. I had sent each of them a message 40 minutes ago from the corridor outside the chamber before I even reached the embassy. The message contained 3 sentences. It told them what I intended to do. It told them what we had found in the trade violation records, and it asked if they were willing to stand. By the time I walked into this room, all 7 had replied. Priya passed me her tablet. 7 green confirmations. 7 species, each of which had their own grievances, their own reasons, their own versions of tonight's humiliation quietly endured for years. They are going to file independent ethics complaints, I said. Their own submissions, separate from ours, citing coercion in last night's session motion. The tribunal will be facing 8 filings simultaneously when it opens. Varath is going to call this coordinated destabilization, Owen said. Varath can call it whatever he wants, I said. It will be entirely legal. Every filing, every termination notice, every data point in the violations record, all of it obtained and submitted through correct procedure. That is the part he will not know how to answer. He expected us to react with emotion, with protests and demands and the kind of noise that he could dismiss. I picked up the 1 remaining tablet from the console edge. He did not expect paperwork. Claire made a sound that was almost a laugh. The tension in the room shifted, not gone, but changed, moving from dread into something more purposeful. We have 6 hours, I said. Let's use every one of them. Part 3. Francis filed the trade violation submission at 11 minutes past midnight. It was 47 pages long, cross-referenced against the conclave's own resource equity statutes, formatted according to tribunal procedural requirements that most member species had never bothered to read. She had spent 3 years building that document, and she filed it the way you place a stone on a board, quietly, precisely, in exactly the right position. The tribunal's automated acknowledgement came back in 8 minutes. That alone was significant. The system was required to acknowledge all filings, but it normally took hours. 8 minutes meant the document had triggered the tribunal's priority classification algorithm. It had recognized the number of violations cited, cross-checked them against existing records, and flagged the submission as requiring immediate docket assignment. End watched the screen and said nothing for a long moment. Then, it is already in their system. Good, I said. Now the notices. Owen had prepared the termination packages over the previous hour. 67 documents, each printed in the original treaty language and the conclave standard language, each carrying the legal citation for the termination clause, each signed by me in the physical ink that conclave diplomatic law still required for formal withdrawal. We were one of the few species that had read the physical signature requirement carefully enough to know it still applied. I signed all 67. My hand was tired before I finished. Owen lined them up in order of delivery priority and divided the stack between our 6 remaining attachés, including 2 who had been off duty and came in without being asked when the session alert went out. Humans, when they understand the stakes, do not wait to be told. The attachés went out in pairs at 12:30. Each pair had a specific route, a specific order of delivery, and a specific instruction. Hand the notice directly to a duty officer or overnight ambassador staff member. Do not leave it at a desk. Do not use the diplomatic drop system. Put it in a hand. The first delivery was to the Kethori embassy. That was deliberate. We wanted them to have the notice first. Not as a warning they would not be able to stop anything, but because the record would show that we had been direct. We had not hidden our move or sent it last. We had sent it first, to the party most responsible for the evening's events, and then to everyone else. I watched the delivery confirmations come in over the next 2 hours. Each one a small light turning green on Priya's board. Each one irreversible. While the notices were going out, Priya was working on the broadcast. I had asked her to prepare a short recorded message, no more than 4 minutes, to be transmitted on the open public relay that the conclave used for member announcements. The same relay that Voreth had used for his broadcast. We had every right to use it. Our membership, probationary as it was, included transmission access. After tonight, that access would no longer apply, so we were going to use it once correctly before we let it go. The message was in 43 languages. Priya's team had prepared translations during the same period Francis was finalizing the tribunal filing. The translations were not automated. Each one had been checked by a native speaker in our network, because we were not going to send a message to 43 species and have a single phrase land wrong. I recorded the base version in English, and then in standard conclave common language. I sat in the embassy's small recording room, looked at the lens, and spoke. I did not apologize for humanity. That was the first decision I had made, and I did not revisit it. Apology would have confirmed Voreth's framing, that there was something to apologize for, that his presentation had been a legitimate critique rather than a staged procedure designed to serve a political outcome. Instead, I explained simply what humanity was withdrawing from and why. I spoke about the termination clauses, about our legal right to invoke them, about the tribunal filing and what it contained. I spoke about the broadcast the conclave had aired, and I noted, without anger, without dramatic language, that it had presented a partial record of human history without context, consent, or advance notice, in violation of 3 separate conclave communication protocols that I cited by number. Then I said this: humanity was invited into this conclave as a probationary member. We accepted those terms in good faith. What occurred in the chamber tonight was not a review conducted in good faith. We recognize the difference, and we will not pretend otherwise to preserve a comfort that was never extended to us. The last line was the one I had written and rewritten 6 times before I got it right. We were invited to be managed. We decline. Priya sent the broadcast out at 2:15 in the morning. It went to every system that had received Voreth's transmission. Same relay, same reach, different message. At 2:40 the first response came in, not from the Kethori, from the Earl ambassador Sira Allen. She had been the one with the distress light on her collar during the session. Her message was short. We received your filing notification. We have prepared our own submission. With your permission, we will file at 300 hours. I wrote back immediately. You do not need my permission. File when you are ready. She filed at 2:58. By 4 in the morning, 6 of the 7 species I had spoken with had filed their own ethics complaints with the tribunal. Each one was independent, each one cited different specific incidents, and each one was legally coherent. The seventh species, the Melhari, sent a message saying they were still consulting internally. I told them to take the time they needed and that our support was not conditional on speed. They filed at 4:45. 8 complaints in the tribunal system before sunrise, each one from a different species, each one pointing at the same institutional pattern of Kethori procedural manipulation. The tribunal had no mechanism for dismissing a coordinated body of evidence from multiple independent member species. It was required, by its own charter, to convene a full panel within 72 hours of receiving more than 3 simultaneous complaints on related matters. 8 complaints meant the panel was mandatory. The session would have to happen. Owen did the math at around 5 in the morning, after his second cup of something our onboard food system called coffee, and which tasted approximately like coffee if coffee had never actually been good. The Kethori will spend the next 2 hours trying to find a procedural way to block the tribunal panel, he said. They will not find one, because the tribunal charter predates most of the procedural modifications the Kethori have introduced over the last 30 years. The original language is clean. They wrote the tribunal to use against others, Frances said, without looking up from her screen. They never imagined anyone would use it against them. Most powerful institutions make that mistake, Claire said. They build the rule when they are on top, expecting to stay there. She was right, and that was not specific to any alien species. It was a pattern we had seen in human institutions throughout our own history. Power tends to build structures that protect itself. The error is always the same, assuming the structure will never be turned around. I walked out of the main embassy room and down the short corridor to the small observation port. Outside, the station's hull curved away into star-filled space. The system's sun, not ours, was still below the horizon of the station's orientation, but the light was already beginning to catch the outer edges of the station's upper ring. On Vareth 9, that counted as dawn. Claire found me there a few minutes later. She stood beside me without speaking for a moment. "The notices are all confirmed," she said. "Last one came in 4 minutes ago, 67 for 67. And the morning session opens at 6, I said. Voreth will have been briefed by now. His staff will have been working since the first notice arrived. Yes. Are you ready to go back in there? I looked at the growing light on the station's edge. 12 years of careful diplomacy, 9 years of this posting, hundreds of conversations, thousands of small negotiations, all of it built on the assumption that the structure we were working within was operating in reasonable good faith. It had not been. That was a painful thing to know, but pain, I had found, was often just clarity arriving in an unpleasant form. It told you something true that you had not wanted to face, and once you faced it, you could move. Yes, I said, let's go. Part 4. The chamber looked different at 6 in the morning. The same curved walls, the same tiered seating, the same vast screens, but the atmosphere was nothing like the previous evening. Last night had felt like a performance. This morning felt like the moment after a building realizes it has a crack running through its foundation. I walked in with Claire and Owen on either side of me and our 2 legal attachés immediately behind. We took our seats at the human delegation table without rushing. Several delegate heads turned as we entered. I noticed the Earl ambassador, Sira Allen, glance at me from across the chamber. She gave a very small nod. I returned it. Voreth arrived at 6:14. I watched him enter. He was moving differently than the evening before, still deliberate, still composed in the way his species presented composure. But there was a quality to his movement that reminded me of someone who had just been given bad news and was deciding how to respond to it in public. His aide was beside him, and they exchanged a brief series of words before Voreth took the central platform. He looked at the human delegation table. His 4 eyes settled on me for a moment. Then he called the session to order. This session has been called to address procedural matters arising from overnight submissions to the Conclave Ethics Tribunal, he said, as well as diplomatic communications received from the human delegation. He said the word communications, the way someone says a word when they mean something stronger but have decided to maintain the surface of professionalism. The conclave recognizes, he continued, that the human delegation has filed notice of treaty termination for 67 bilateral agreements with the conclave's central institutional body. A ripple of sound moved through the chamber, not loud, more like the collective intake of breath that a large group makes when something lands that they had heard about but not quite believed until this moment. This action is being characterized by some parties as an overreaction to last evening's civilizational review, Voreth said. The conclave wishes to invite the human delegation to reconsider. I raised my hand, the standard gesture for requesting the speaker's platform. Voreth paused. He could not deny the request. The floor protocols were clear. Any recognized delegation could request the platform between items. He extended his hand toward the central mic in the way that a person gestures when they are being polite about something they would rather not do. I walked to the platform. I set my folio on the edge of it. I looked out at the chamber and waited until the residual sound died down completely. There is a kind of silence that you can build just by being patient with noise. I had learned that in my first year as an ambassador, from a very old Melhari diplomat who had told me that the speaker who waits for quiet receives more of it than the one who demands it. The chamber went still. "Thank you," I said. "I want to address 3 things. I will be as clear and as brief as I can be." I opened the folio. First, the treaty terminations. 67 withdrawal notices were delivered overnight. Each notice invokes the 90-day termination clause present in the original treaty language. These clauses were standard inclusions in all agreements signed during Earth's probationary membership period. They exist in the documents. They are legally valid. The terminations are not a reaction made in anger. They are a decision made on the basis of new information about the nature of those agreements and the institutional context in which they were signed. Voreth started to speak. I continued without pausing. Second, the Ethics Tribunal filing. At 12:11 this morning, Earth's legal delegation submitted a 47-page evidence brief to the Conclave Ethics Tribunal documenting 14 instances in which Kethori trade agreements with smaller member species contain provisions that violate the Conclave's resource equity statutes of 2241. The filing was assigned to the tribunal's priority docket at 12:19. The tribunal is required by its charter to convene a full panel in response to this submission, alongside the 7 additional complaints filed independently by member species between 2:58 and 4:45 this morning. The chamber noise was no longer just a ripple. It was a wave, and it was building. Several delegates were speaking to their aides in urgent undertones. A few had produced their own tablets and were reading from them with expressions I had learned to recognize across species lines as the expression of someone encountering information that changes their understanding of a situation. I waited again, same patience, same silence. Third and finally, the civilizational review. The chamber quieted faster this time. Last evening's session presented a curated selection of historical human footage to a galaxy-wide audience without the advance notice required under Conclave Communication Protocol 14, Section 3. The motion was filed 63 days ago under a procedural subcategory that bypasses the standard session preview process. The broadcast authorization was obtained from 12 co-signatories more than 40 days before the session, meaning it was coordinated well before any of the stated justifications for the review were presented to this body. I looked at Voreth directly. I am not here to dispute whether human history contains difficult chapters. It does. Every species in this room has chapters they would not choose to display on a galaxy-wide feed without context or consent. What I am here to say is that what occurred in this chamber last night was not a review. It was a procedure designed to produce a specific outcome, the indefinite delay of Earth's full membership, using institutional mechanisms that were built and maintained by the same delegation now chairing the motion. The chamber was very quiet. We have not filed these terminations because we are angry. We have filed them because we have determined, on the basis of evidence, that the institutional framework governing those agreements was not operating in good faith. We cannot in conscience maintain commitments to a structure that was not extending the same commitment to us. I closed the folio. We are not leaving the conclave. We are withdrawing from agreements that we now understand were designed to limit us rather than include us. We remain willing to negotiate new agreements, ones drafted transparently, with equal participation, under terms that apply uniformly to all member species. I stepped back from the mic. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sira Allen of the Earl stood up. She did not speak. She simply stood. 7 seconds later, the Melhari ambassador stood. Then the Dorvani. Then the castle. One by one, 4 more delegations rose to their feet, each from the species that had filed overnight complaints. They did not coordinate the timing. I know this because Sira told me later that none of them had planned it. It simply happened, in the way things happen when people who have been waiting for a moment finally recognize that it has arrived. 8 delegations standing, 7 of them not human. Voreth looked at the standing delegations. He looked at me. He looked at the chamber, which was now producing the loudest sustained noise I had ever heard in a formal conclave session, not shouting, but the dense layered sound of hundreds of simultaneous conversations, all happening at once. He called for order. The chamber took longer than usual to quiet. When it did, he said, "The delegation from humanity is suggesting that conclave procedure was manipulated for political purposes. This is a serious allegation that—" "It is a filing," I said from my seat. The floor rules technically required me to use the platform, but protocol also allowed for brief clarification exchanges from seated position. Not an allegation. An evidence-supported submission to the body this conclave created specifically to evaluate such matters. The difference is significant. Owen made a very quiet sound beside me that he converted quickly into a cough. Voreth's expression was the closest I had seen to what I would call, in a human face, caught off guard. He recovered quickly. His species was trained for public composure the way ours is trained to hide how tired we are. The Kethori delegation reserves the right to respond formally to all filings through proper channels. "Of course," I said. "And the conclave wishes to note that unilateral withdrawal from 67 central agreements creates significant uncertainty for all member species who rely on those frameworks for." The 90-day clause was designed precisely to prevent abrupt disruption, Francis said from beside me, quietly but clearly enough to carry. 90 days is sufficient time for any affected party to establish alternative arrangements. The clause was written by the conclave's own legal drafting committee. We are using it correctly. Voreth looked at Francis. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has read every document in a room more carefully than anyone else in it. The session continued for another 3 hours. There were procedural motions, counter-motions, requests for clarification, and at one point a 40-minute recess that I was fairly certain Voreth needed to consult with his senior advisors. During the recess, 6 additional delegations came to speak to me informally. 3 of them asked what humanity intended to do next. 2 asked quietly whether the trade violation evidence was as strong as the filing suggested. One ambassador, from a species whose name I will not mention because they had not yet made any public move, simply shook my hand in a way that meant, in their culture, acknowledgement of respect. When the session resumed, Voreth announced that the Ethics Tribunal panel would be convened within 72 hours, as required by charter. He did not look at me when he said it. He announced that the Kethori delegation would formally contest the scope of the trade violation filing. He announced that the conclave would establish a review process for the communication protocols used in the previous evening's session. He did not announce a delay to Earth's membership review. Because he could not. Because the moment I walked back into that chamber with 67 termination receipts, a filed tribunal complaint, and 8 delegations prepared to stand, the political calculation had changed. Blocking Earth's membership now meant blocking it in front of an audience that had seen the evidence of why we had withdrawn. The cost of that had become higher than the benefit. After the session ended and the chamber began to clear, Claire and I walked out the same door I had walked through the previous night. The corridor was the same. The ambient hum was the same. The viewport at the end of the hall was the same. Everything else was different. Part 5. The tribunal panel convened 51 hours later. Not 72, 51. The panel chair, a Dorvani judge named Shabrain, had accelerated the timeline, citing the volume and quality of the submitted evidence. I had met Shabrain twice in 9 years, briefly and in passing. She had a reputation for reading every document submitted to her in full, which was apparently unusual enough to be noteworthy even among tribunal judges. The Kethori's legal team arrived at the tribunal chamber with 40 representatives. Ours had 3, Francis, End, and Owen. Francis had been awake for 31 hours by the time the panel opened and showed no sign of this whatsoever. I was not in the tribunal chamber. Ambassadors do not participate in tribunal proceedings directly. The submissions speak for themselves, and legal counsel handles the floor. I watched the feed from the embassy, sitting on a low bench in the monitoring room with a cup of actual tea that Priya had sourced from somewhere on the station, and Claire sitting beside me reading through the next phase of our diplomatic proposal on her tablet. The first session lasted 4 hours. Shabrain read sections of the 47-page filing aloud into the record, pausing at each statute citation to confirm the relevant text. When the Kethori legal team attempted to argue that the trade clauses in question had been approved by the signatory species, she asked them to produce the documentation showing those species had been informed the clauses violated the resource equity statutes before signing. They could not produce it because it did not exist. The second session was shorter, 2 hours. The Kethori team submitted a counterfiling arguing that the resource equity statutes had been superseded by subsequent conclave trade framework agreements. End had anticipated this argument. He had prepared a 30-page response demonstrating that the subsequent agreements explicitly preserved the statute's core provisions through a preservation clause on page 11 of the 2267 framework document. Page 11. It had been there the whole time. After the second session, Owen called me from the tribunal anteroom. "Francis is in very good shape," he said. "The Kethori team has run out of procedural arguments. They are now requesting a 90-day delay to assemble additional evidence." What is Brain's response? She denied it. She cited the fact that the original filing was built on public record documents, conclave filings, treaty texts, and published trade data. If the evidence is public record, she said, additional time to prepare a response is not justified. When does she rule? She said she would issue preliminary findings within 5 days, full ruling within 30. I set the communicator down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The monitoring room's lights were soft and steady. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear 2 of our attachés talking, quiet voices, nothing urgent. Priya knocked on the open door. "You have a call request, Secretary General Diane Forsyth." I had been expecting this call since the previous morning. The fact that it had taken this long meant the Secretary General had been deliberate about the timing, which was very much her manner. She did not react to things immediately. She processed, assessed, and then acted, which was one of the reasons she had the job. I took the call in the embassy's private communications room. Diane Forsyth appeared on the screen. She was in her office in Geneva, early evening there, based on the light behind her. She was a composed woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in the manner of someone who had been reviewing documents and paused to make a call. "Cale," she said. "Madam Secretary General. I've been briefed on the full timeline. I've read the tribunal filing and the session transcripts." She paused. "Walk me through your decision to proceed without authorization." It was a fair question. I had not contacted Geneva before filing the termination notices. I had not asked for approval before recording the broadcast. I had acted on the authority of my ambassadorial mandate, which granted broad discretionary power in active diplomatic situations. But 67 treaty terminations and a public galactic broadcast pushed the definition of broad discretionary power to its absolute outer boundary. "The window was 6 hours," I said. "A request for authorization would have taken 8 minimum to receive a response through secure channels. By the time approval came back, the morning session would already be open, and every move we made would look reactive rather than prepared. You made a unilateral decision affecting Earth's relationship with 200 species. I made a decision that invoked legal clauses already present in signed agreements, filed a properly structured tribunal submission, and recorded a factual public statement. I did not commit us to any new agreements or positions without authorization. I withdrew from existing ones using the mechanisms those agreements themselves provided." She looked at me for a long moment. "The Council reviewed your actions this morning," she said. "There are members who believe you exceeded your mandate." "I understand that. There are also members who believe you did exactly what an ambassador is supposed to do when the situation demands it." Another pause. "The vote was not unanimous." "I would not expect it to be." "No." She took the reading glasses off her forehead and set them on her desk. "I'll be honest with you, Cale. When I watched last night's broadcast, the one Voreth put out, I was furious, and I did not know what to do with that fury in a way that would actually help us. By the time I had worked out a response, you were already 3 steps ahead of where I was." "I had been thinking about this for 3 years," I said. "You had about 40 minutes. That made her smile briefly. "Yes, well, the Council will formally review your mandate in 60 days. In the meantime, you are to continue as acting ambassador with full authority pending that review." "Understood. And Cale, I want to be clear about something." She leaned forward slightly. "Whatever happens in the Council review, what you did last night gave every person on Earth something they hadn't had in 12 years of probationary membership." "What's that?" "The feeling that someone in that room was actually standing up." She ended the call. I sat in the communications room for a minute afterward, just breathing. Then I went back to work. The tribunal's preliminary findings came in 4 days, not 5. HFY Brain issued a 12-page document that confirmed probable violations of the resource equity statutes in 9 of the 14 cases cited, and ordered a formal investigation into the remaining 5. The Kethori were formally suspended from chairing any conclave committee that involved resource allocation or membership decisions pending the full ruling. Voreth was personally named in the suspension order as the delegation head whose authorization signatures appeared on 7 of the 9 confirmed cases. I read the document 3 times, not because it was complicated. Francis had drafted a plain language summary that covered the essentials in 2 paragraphs, but because some things deserve to be read carefully. Some things you want to sit with fully before you move on from them. On the day the preliminary findings went public, my communicator received more than 400 messages. Most were from other conclave member species. Cautious, carefully worded messages from ambassadors testing the temperature, seeing how Earth was handling the new situation, beginning the slow opening movements of potential new relationships. 11 of them were from species that had never directly communicated with our delegation before. 3 messages were from Kethori secondary officials, not Voreth's office, but representatives of Kethori commercial and scientific bodies, politely worded, expressing interest in discussing certain bilateral arrangements in a new framework. I found those particularly interesting because they confirmed what I had suspected. The Kethori were not a monolith. Voreth's political faction was in trouble. Other parts of his government were already calculating their next positions. I did not respond to those 3 messages immediately. I let them sit for 2 days, which is the Kethori equivalent of what humans call making someone wait. Sira Allen came to visit in person on the 3rd day after the findings. She arrived at the embassy without a large delegation, just herself and 1 aide, which for a Earl ambassador was as close to casual as their diplomatic culture allowed. I received her in the small meeting room off the main embassy space. Priya brought tea, this time from actual Earl stock that Sira had sent over the previous day. We talked for a long time, not about strategy or next moves, about the texture of things, about what it had been like to be a small species in a conclave structured around Kethori preferences, about the 12 years of human probationary membership from her perspective, watching from the outside, about what she had thought when she watched Voreth's broadcast the previous night. I thought, she said after a long pause, that you would do what every species does in that situation, that you would submit to the review, accept the delay, make it look like cooperation. We considered it, I said. This was true. Owen had raised it during the late-night session as a possible alternative. Give them the acknowledgement they asked for. Buy time. Find another angle later. What made you choose differently? I thought about it honestly. I think we have spent a lot of our history learning that there are situations where waiting for a better moment means the better moment never comes, where the cost of enduring something that is wrong is that it becomes the permanent condition. We are not always good at knowing when to push. Historically, we have got that badly wrong in many directions, but when we do know, we tend to commit fully. Sira was quiet for a moment. The Earl have a word, she said. We use it to describe an animal that has been underestimated by predators for so long that when it finally turns, the predator has no reference point, no memory of the teeth. What is the word? She said it in her own language, a word with a long first syllable and a soft ending, like a breath released slowly. What does it translate to approximately? I asked. She thought for a moment. The moment a thing stops pretending it is smaller than it is. I held that for a while. Outside the meeting room's small window, the station's lights were cycling into their evening mode, a slow, warm shift that the human engineering team had apparently lobbied for during the station's original construction, on the grounds that circadian rhythm management improved diplomatic performance. I had always thought that was a slightly absurd detail. Now I thought it was a very human thing to care about. We are going to refile, I said. Earth's application for full conclave membership. New application, new terms. We want to draft the membership agreement ourselves, in consultation with the conclave's legal body, rather than accepting a pre-existing framework that was written before we were involved. They will resist that, Sira said. Some will, some will not. The Kethori have just lost the ability to chair the membership review committee. That changes the composition of the body that will evaluate our application. We are also going to propose a joint legal review of membership terms for the 7 species whose trade agreements showed violations. We think those agreements need to be renegotiated, and we would like to participate in that process as a full partner rather than an observer. Sira's expression shifted in a way that I had learned, over 9 years, to read as something close to gratitude in Earl body language. That was not something I expected you to offer, she said. It is the right thing to do, I said simply, and it is also good strategy. We are better in this conclave as part of a coalition of species that trusts us than as a single member fighting for standing on our own. Humans have learned that one many times over. We would like to not have to learn it again." She laughed, a genuine one, the kind that catches even the laugher slightly off guard. The new membership application was filed 11 days later. It was 40 pages long, drafted by Francis and End, reviewed by our legal team on Earth, and translated by Priya's communications group into 17 languages before submission. It proposed a full, equal membership structure with no conditional review clauses, no oversight committee chaired by any single species, and a mandatory 5-year review of all existing trade agreements within the conclave framework. The vote on the application was scheduled for 40 days after filing, standard procedure. It passed in 31. The margin was not close. 141 in favor, 48 opposed, 11 abstaining. The Kethori voted against, along with their closest aligned delegations, but the bloc that had formed around the ethics tribunal process held, and several species that had previously voted with the Kethori on procedural matters broke from that pattern for the first time. I watched the vote from the chamber floor, seated at the human delegation table in the same seat I had occupied the night of the civilizational review. When the count was announced, Claire, sitting beside me, exhaled very slowly and carefully. I did not celebrate in the chamber. This was a deliberate choice, partly tactical, partly genuine. We had won something, but what we had won was the right to begin working properly, and work was not something you celebrated before doing. You celebrated after, quietly, once the next thing was built. Back at the embassy that evening, Priya ordered food from every human-compatible restaurant on the station's commercial ring. Owen found a bottle of something that one of the Melhari ambassadors had sent over as congratulations, which smelled like nothing any of us recognized and tasted, after some careful testing, like warm honey and something faintly electrical. We all agreed it was fine. End insisted it was excellent. Francis pointed out that End had been awake for 22 hours, and his judgment was questionable. It was a quiet evening. No speeches, no ceremony, just 7 people around a table on an alien station, very far from Earth, aware that they had done something that mattered and that there was a great deal more to do. I stepped out at one point and stood in the corridor by the viewport, the same one I had stood at the night everything changed. Stars outside, steady and indifferent and very beautiful. I thought about what Sira had said. The moment a thing stops pretending it is smaller than it is. We had been doing that for 12 years, keeping ourselves small and polite and careful, operating within a framework that was designed to keep us there. I did not regret the care. Care was not the same as weakness, and patience was not the same as acceptance. But there was a difference between choosing restraint and having it chosen for you, between waiting for the right moment and having someone else decide which moments you were allowed. We had stopped waiting. That was all it was in the end. Not power in the sense of force, not superiority, just the decision, made fully and finally, to stop moving at the speed of other people's comfort and start moving at our own. Humans are many things, not all of them simple or easy to defend. We have a long and complicated record on this planet and now, increasingly, beyond it. But we are also stubborn in a particular way. The kind of stubborn that is not quite pride and not quite anger but something underneath both of them. Something that does not require an audience and does not need permission. We do not perform our determination, we just keep moving. I went back inside. Claire had saved me a seat and a portion of whatever Owen had ordered. Priya was telling a story that was clearly making End laugh harder than it probably deserved. Francis was already reading the next set of documents. We had a new membership agreement to honor, 48 opposition delegations to gradually work with, a 30-day tribunal ruling still pending, 7 trade renegotiations to support, and an entirely new set of bilateral agreements to draft from the ground up. I sat down, picked up my fork and got back to work.